For a game to be linear, it must have a set path through which the player progresses while coming across an orchestrated set of events according to what was determined by the game's developer. Characters you meet, objects you find, and story beats that you trigger are all meticulously plotted out, and you will encounter them largely at the pace and in the order that you are supposed to. Sometimes optional paths or hidden items might exist, and there might even be some missable elements of importance that could affect the game in some ways, but generally nothing that drastically alters the outcome or the overall experience. This is what makes up a linear game, and it's been the way games have been designed since the beginning. These days, on the contrary, we see many, perhaps the majority of big action adventure games take on a different format. Now, instead of getting to the end of a level, you simply complete a mission or a quest. Instead of selecting a level from a menu, you select a destination from a map. While linear games have never quite been eliminated completely, we are certainly seeing far less of them than we used to. In fact, many game franchises that started out as relatively linear have become more and more open with subsequent releases, like the Metal Gear Solid series. Clearly, open world games are not a fad to be ignored, but rather a reality to be accommodated. But why is this? What the hell happened to linear games? Many gamers prefer the emergent open world structure and style of games for the obvious benefits that it provides to its immersion. This is easily understandable, and there's nothing wrong with people playing what they like and asking for more of it. But at what cost? Well, it seems the cost is to the linear game. Back when running from one side of the screen to the other was the only real way games could be made, it made the most sense as a general format. After all, the machines on which games were played back then had less power behind them than the clock in your microwave does now, so options were understandably limited. What was once a limitation became the expected norm, and the linear game was just known as a game. That eventually changed though, and many games started to experiment with non-linear level design, meaning you could go a number of different ways, have a number of different experiences, and you could theoretically have several different playthroughs that all felt different depending on what you choose to do. This concept goes much further back than you might realize. Plenty of old role-playing games like Atari's Adventure and countless other games of that sort from that time would be some of the first to really give the player autonomy over which direction they would go in and what challenges they would face first. While ultimately most of these games did still require a certain sequence of events to take place for true progression, the feeling of freedom would be one that gamers would want more and more of as time went on. Eventually, as we got into the 90s and the early 2000s, games like Grand Theft Auto, Shenmue, and Elder Scrolls games would really start to capitalize on this concept. Open world games would become their own thing and a real genre that people would go out of their way to choose over a linear experience. And it was a logical extension of what games could be, choosing your own path, and seeing the effects of those choices in the story and on your character certainly go a long way to feeding into the addictive loop for many players. Eventually, games would set many of the standards that we still see today with mini-maps, waypoints, side quests, and the like. Now, it could be argued that ultimately, open world games are what happened to linear games. The emergence of a new style of game world that brings the world to the player in a completely open format was certainly an exciting idea that made linear games of the past look like lesser experiences. But to understand the situation more fully is to understand why linear games weren't cutting the mustard with everybody. Firstly, linear games have demonstrably less replay value than open world games. This is something that I, a fan of many a linear game, can readily admit. And with the price of games being $60, which could likely be increased soon, and special editions being even more, it's totally understandable to see why somebody would want to get more content and a larger world to explore out of their games. Surely there is plenty of respect to be had for classics like Half-Life, Dead Space, and Crash Bandicoot, but what happens after you beat them? You could play through them again on a harder difficulty, sure, but other than that, what really is there other than a bonus level or two? Usually not much. The game is done and it sits on a shelf somewhere for untold amounts of time until you either give it to somebody else or play it again. However, if you were to ask that question about an open world game, you wouldn't get that answer. There's plenty to do, plenty to see, and sometimes even more side content than there is story-related content waiting for you after the main story is complete. While on paper, this can seem like a superior format to the typical linear experience full of pathways and corridors, and for many large adventures, it probably is a superior way to present that experience. But it's not without its own faults. If an open world game isn't full of lots to do, it can easily get dinged for that by reviewers and gamers alike for feeling too desolate. On the other hand, some open world games are packed so tightly with things to do, like some say The Witcher 3 was, it can be distracting and difficult to stay on task for the average player. So while open world games can be awe-inspiring in terms of vastness, and intuitive in the way the adventure is given to you, they do come with their own set of challenges and standards to meet. This is part of the reason why linear games haven't ever quite gone away. In fact, it could easily be argued that open world games have made linear games better because of the ideas that the open world style have created, such as connecting levels and removing the disjointed feeling that level select menus can be responsible for. Many linear games have since adapted to those concerns without losing the benefits of keeping their own pace with orchestrated linear designs. Naughty Dog's Uncharted games and The Last of Us are prime examples of linear games that have learned from open world games without becoming open world games themselves. And for many, this is the sweet spot. Immersion-breaking mini-maps and objective markers aren't needed, yet they don't feel like claustrophobic corridor games either. So perhaps linear games aren't going away in favor of open world ones, but rather both styles of game are just learning from each other and improving all around. That's it for this video. If you enjoyed and would like to see more, feel free to hit that subscribe button and hit the notification bell to ensure you'll be notified when new videos go up.